Hi. Gaia 2 from Roland inherits the hands-on design philosophy of the original Gaia and infuses it with elements from Roland's flagship Phantom Wavetable engine, an interesting motional pad control and mod source, wave shaping tools, and plenty of effects, as well as support for vintage models of several of Roland's classics. In this video, I'll take a detailed look at what's inside, how it's different from Roland's other current offerings, as well as pros and cons compared to the competition. At the end of the video, I'll play you quite a few of its presets. Before I start, a quick disclosure: Roland sent Gaia 2 over for review. No money changed hands, they have no say over the content of this video, and don't get to see it before it's published. This channel is funded mainly by viewers who subscribe to exclusive content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Okay, let's start with an overview. Gaia 2 is a digital synth with 22 voice polyphony. Each voice has 3 oscillators, one of which has a fairly capable wavetable and wave shaping engine with 63 built-in wavetables, and the other 2 oscillators have simpler wave shapes but with interesting shape options, along with supersaw sync, ring, FM, and crossmod options, and even a couple of funky noise options. These oscillators then get routed through a mixer, then get sent on to a multi-mode filter with drive, and finally to an effects section with 3 slots, chorus, reverb or delay, and one of 50 interesting built-in effects, including distortion, pitch shifters, scatter effects, and more, as well as a master EQ and compression if you want them. In terms of modulation, you've got 2 per voice LFOs, including a complex step LFO shape. You can point each of the LFOs to one of 4 destinations. Then you've got 2 ADSR envelopes dedicated to the filter and amp, as well as an additional 3rd attack decay oscillator envelope, which can be pointed to pitch, as well as a few other oscillator parameters. And then you've got the very interesting motional pad, which you can use both as a control surface and as a mod source if you record automation into it, and then you can play it back. You can point each of the X and Y coordinates to any one of a number of destinations as well. It's also got a couple of wave shaping controls we'll talk about for the wavetable oscillator. Phase mod and shaper mod, we'll talk about these in detail. Gaia 2 is very easy to use, I think, and extremely hands-on. There are plenty of knobs, faders, and buttons here. There are a few shift functions, most of them are on the panel in square brackets. And then while there are quite a few knobs and faders here, there are a few additional parameters that you access in menus. Now you could do this through the module selection tool. So just scroll through the different modules and say, for example, oscillator 1, might have a few additional parameters that you can't access on the panel. You can actually also use the motional pad as a cursor to select modules, edit parameters from lists. But most of the time, I don't do any of these. A quick shortcut to get to a module is just to hold the menu button and then turn a knob in that module. So for example, turn a knob in oscillator 1 to get to its parameters, hold menu, and turn an LFO knob to access its parameters. Most of the time, I don't think you'll find many parameters here that you can't access on the panel, except maybe for the effects. Hold menu, touch one of its knobs. Some of the effects have quite a few additional controls beyond the 3 or 2 controls on the panel. As you may have seen here on the module map, you've got the common and control modules. Those 2 are accessible by shortcut, just by touching a parameter that lives in them. Gaia 2 also has a simple built-in arpeggiator along with a polyphonic 64-step sequencer, which has 4 automation lanes that you can point to a nice list of parameters, including quite a few effect parameters. Aside from its comprehensive internal engine, Gaia 2 comes with a built-in model of Roland's SH101, and it lets you load a few additional models which you have to pay for. You can either flat out buy or rent models of the JX8P, Juno 106, and Jupiter 8. All of these models, by the way, are based on Roland's Zencore engine, not ACB, like some of their respective boutiques. The JX8P boutique, by the way, is also based on the Zencore engine, not ACB. You've got 256 factory presets, so quite a few to choose from, and then 512 user slots. And each model also comes with, I think, around 100 or so different presets. Presets are stored in groups, A through D in case of the factory presets, or A through H in case of the user presets, and then in banks, and finally tones within banks. Each of the factory presets, by the way, comes with a sequence. I'll play you some of these at the end of the video. And as you can hear, there are seamless transitions between the presets, so audio doesn't cut off, which is very nice. The synth isn't multi-timbral, if that's your next question. And as you can see, presets load up very quickly. In terms of build, the enclosure is plastic, the top panel is aluminum, the encoders and faders are plastic, but overall feel solid. Finally, for this generation of synths from Roland, the screen is OLED and not an LCD, so the viewing angles and refresh rate of the screen is excellent. The keybit also feels great. It's velocity sensitive, but doesn't have aftertouch. The pitch bend and mod wheels are pretty small. They're plastic, give good control, but there's certainly space here to have made them bigger. If I had to complain about one thing with these controls is that the buttons don't click, and I sometimes have to press a couple of times to get it to register. In terms of connectivity, you've got MIDI in and out, a pedal jack that can be assigned to a surprising number of destinations. You've got 1/4 inch left, right, and headphone outputs, a handy headphone jack up front, and then 2 USB jacks, USB Type A, which you can connect a MIDI controller to, a storage device, or Roland's WC1, a little dongle that connects to your Wi-Fi network and lets you transfer synth models and presets back and forth from Roland's cloud service onto your synth. More on this later. And then it's got a USB Type-C port for MIDI and for stereo audio in and out over USB. Okay, let's dive in and take a look at the oscillator section. All 3 oscillators have coarse and fine tuning. Coarse tuning goes up and down octaves. And then fine tuning is smooth, or if you hold shift, goes up and down in semitone increments. The first oscillator is a wavetable oscillator. You've got your choice of 63 wavetables, which are a bunch of waveforms stacked together, and you can use the wavetable position knob to scan through that wavetable, or of course modulate wavetable position using an LFO or the oscillator envelope. The wavetables are fairly interesting. I won't go through all of them here, but there are quite a few timbres to explore. Many are metallic and harsh, but each has its own character. It can also attempt to say a few things. We design the future, I think. So pretty cool. It's a shame you can't load your own wavetables into this, but there are quite a few to explore here. Anyway, beside the simple wavetables, you've also got a couple of interesting wave shaping options. The phase modulation and shaper modulation basically take over the motional pad from its regular modulation duties. Phase modulation is kind of like pulse width modulation, but for any waveform. So let's, for example, choose a square wave. So this may seem like pulse width modulation on a square wave. Let's take a look at what it does to a few other simple waveforms. And if we move to a more complex waveform, you'll see that it's kind of like the same thing. Scrunches up one part of the waveform and expands the other. So that's phase modulation. Let's take a look at shaper modulation. I'll go back to a simple sine wave. Now, shaper modulation is actually 2 for 1. On the y-axis, it acts like simple drive, which you can see pretty clearly on this sine wave. And then on the x-axis, it uses this chart, this table, as a transfer function for the waveform. Now, since this is linear, nothing happens, but if we choose a different transfer function, like let's say this one, then you can see how the two shapes start to merge together. So I guess that's the best way to describe this, kind of taking this shape and superimposing it, and of course this works with drive as well on the y-axis. So maybe do one more, this crazy one. all this shaping, all these harmonics are happening, of course, without any filtering. So that's more or less the wavetable oscillator. Let's take a look at the other two, the virtual analog style oscillators. Each of these waveforms has its own shape option, which lets you morph its shape. And the saw and pulse waveform or square waveform have two shape options. One regular pulse width option, which looks like this. And the more interesting option, I think, is the fat option. So in this case, the saw morphs into a saw an octave below. And same goes for the pulse. So this isn't quite pulse width modulation, but you can modulate this and it sounds pretty awesome. So this fat option is great. Then you've got a super saw with a detuning option. And then the quirkiest of them all is the noise oscillator. I'm just going to hold this. So this is pretty funky. Pink morphs into applause. And then white into pink. That makes sense. Stream into bubbles. Final into an engine. And metal wind into whatever this is. These also pitch up and down, but don't play chromatically. And if you're going to ask, can you load your own samples into this? The answer is no, unfortunately, at least not in the current firmware. It would be really cool if they added this, as well as the ability to load up your own wavetables. So the synth isn't multi-timbral, but with some clever modulation, you can do interesting things with it. The oscillators have a few interesting cross-mod options. Sync works on oscillator 3, so oscillator 2, I'll lower its level, forces oscillator 3 to sync based on oscillator 2's cycle. And the result is, of course, the oscillator sync sound. Then ring mod is a shift function, only works on oscillator 2, but is a function of the pitch of both oscillators. It can get pretty harsh, but with a bit of tweaking, can create nice bell-like sounds or any related form of chaos. So when modulated, can create nice effects. And then cross mod also works only on oscillator 2, but is a combination of oscillator 3 and 2. Let's maybe choose sine waves. And if we hit menu and cross mod, there are two cross mod types. It's cross mod 1, cross mod 2. And I found a couple of presets that use the different cross mods. So there are certainly nice FM tones in here as well. Okay, let's move on from the oscillator section through the mixer section, which I can't say much about except that it lets you control the level of the three oscillators and that each of these is also a modulation destination. Anyway, from there, audio gets fed into the filter. This is a multi-mode filter with low pass, high pass, and band pass options, each with 3 slope options. 12 dB per octave, 18 dB, and 24 dB. With, of course, resonance, which can get quite crunchy. It will self-oscillate, by the way, and you can set it to key track. Anyway, it's nice and crunchy. It does reduce levels as you increase resonance quite a bit. In all 3 options, by the way, also the 12 dB per octave, so it certainly would have been nice if there had been an option to compensate for the gain loss with resonance, or just not lose bass at all. This is a digital synth after all. I assume they can do anything they want. And a nice plot twist here, the resonance is especially aggressive on the high pass and band pass modes. Really nice. This is without any drive yet, by the way. So nice work here. And yes, there is drive. Along with drive sensitivity compensation, which you can access using shift and drive. It's like level compensation down for when you drive the audio. So if levels are too extreme, then you can use that to turn audio down. I think it silences the audio a bit too much. Anyway, different levels of input gain and drive produce a different character in the resonance, but can choke the filter a bit too much, which pre-filter drive will tend to do. So certainly if you reduce drive, you'll get a more prominent resonance, and you can always apply distortion after the filter. We'll check that out later. The filter also comes with a dedicated envelope, and I've got a bit of reverb here. And the envelope does do snappy if you want it to. So that's it for the main filter section. There are actually quite a few other filters in here. The amp section has a tone control, which is kind of like a tilt EQ or filter. And then this is a nice segue into the master effects, which have a whole bunch of effects, including filters. You've got 3 effects slots here: chorus, a reverb or delay, and a MFX slot, which can be one of 50 different effects. You can reorder the 3, by the way, in any way you like. I didn't find a shortcut for this. I'm sure there is, but if you press here, you'll be able to choose any one of a few different orders. Let's go for chorus, reverb, and MFX. The effects have a few hands-on controls, and then you can access additional parameters through the menus. The chorus, I think, is really nice, especially type C, which is the JX chorus. And if you hit menu and the chorus button, you'll see a few additional parameters you can control here. I don't know why they insist on adding the noise option, but it's here. If you want it, stereo noise. Then you've got 3 types: the original Juno style choruses with types 1, 2, and 3, and then the combi, so combination, as you'd expect from the Junos. And yeah, my favorite is the JX one. Then there's the reverb / delay with a few options in here, a shimmer verb, and for example here, you've got a few hands-on controls, but this is where you really want to hit menu and jump in to edit things a bit further. So for example, the shimmer verb has 2 pitch shifters, and that's just one of the reverbs. So there's modulation reverb, Integra, SRV. I obviously won't go through all these parameters. And then you've got a few delays. So there are a few nice patterns to be had here depending on which of the taps you choose to use. You can choose the panning for each of the heads, so they go that far with it. So a really nice tape echo emulation here. So that's this slot, and then there's a third MFX slot with a whole bunch of different options in here. Like I mentioned, some of these are filters, so you can route filters in series here. Let's take a look at just a few of these. Resonator is cool. This maybe is better fed with noise. So just noise, but you can tune this. And obviously you can get lost in these. Let's keep exploring. Phasers. More choruses. Autopan. Slicer. Many of these, by the way, are modulation destinations. Let's just keep going, see what else we can find in here. Scatter. Okay. Quite a few distortion options. I think the effects here are one of the main pros of this synth. Nice. Let's keep going a bit more. Guitar amp sims, compressor, limiter, sustainer, more delays. In case maybe you use the reverb here. And there are whole videos that can be made on these. A bit crusher. And phonograph. Pitch shifter. This one's cool. Another nice one. A recursive pitch shifter. And I'm sure we can change that here. Quite a few parameters to get lost in. And then this is sort of like a multi-effect. So those are the M effects. Many of the effect parameters are mod destinations, by the way, which is a good segue into modulation. The simplest mod sources are probably the filter and amp envelope. I think I don't need to say what these do. There are 4-stage envelopes dedicated, by the way. The amp envelope just to level, and the filter envelope just to the filter. You can't point them anywhere else. Then there's the oscillator envelope, which by default points to pitch. It's a simple attack decay envelope, and you can point it to other destinations. If you hit menu, just nudge one of the knobs, then you can point it to any one of a number of oscillator destinations. For example, the oscillator 1 wavetable position. So a very useful oscillator envelope. And then you've got 2 LFOs. You assign LFO destinations by holding this button and just turning the knob of what it is you want to modulate. So let's say that I want to modulate oscillator 1 position. I could just do it like that. Then set a mod depth and rate. Then choose a shape. Usual suspects. Including a slewed random and a snappy random. And then an interesting step sequenced LFO shape. So to edit this, you've got to get into a menu. Again, hold menu and just turn one of the knobs. We can see all the LFO assignments here, but what's important here is enter to edit the step sequence. You can choose any one of 16 steps, the depth, and then there are quite a few interesting curve shapes in here. And this factory preset is a nice example for using the step sequencer in the LFO. I'll lower these. So this is the LFO shape culprit. Let's hold menu and edit that and take a look at the shape. So that's our shape. Hang on. These guys. Let's maybe change the first step, increase its depth. That was that. Change its curve. So pretty nice complex LFO shapes to be had in here. And if you want to assign the LFOs just by looking through a menu, you can. So you don't have to use the assign button. You can just choose, hang on, what it is that you want to modulate over here. Just choose the destination and quite a few to choose from depending on the effect. So you can't always modulate effect parameters, but often you can. Then the next mod source is the motional pad. By default, it points to the filter cutoff and resonance. And like I mentioned, it's both a control and a mod source that you can record. And you can record up to 13 seconds of scribbling. And to activate this, I just need to turn it on. And I now have a new XY mod source. Like I mentioned earlier, you can choose different destinations, and you can also choose from a few templates if you don't want to be bothered with drawing your own. Let's say go with this. So now it's basically behaving like an LFO, but if I go into its settings, I can turn off looping, and then with key trigger, just use this like an envelope. I need to turn it on. Here we go. It's not a polyphonic envelope. It gets triggered once with the first key you play and keeps going as long as it's held. So as not to be confused, the motional pad has a control mode when these two are off. And remember, I talked about the P mod and S mod. These apply only to the wavetable oscillator, and you need to turn them off to get back to controlling the X and Y parameters with the motional pad. The last automation or mod source available here are the 4 lanes in the sequencer. Let's get to that by way of the arpeggiator. The arpeggiator is relatively simple. You turn it on. You've got a few modes: note order, up, down, random, and a few speed scales. And as expected, there are additional options here. You can use the hold here if you like. And there's swing. Duration is the length of the note. Not applicable in this patch. Octave range. Transpose, and I think that's pretty much it for the arpeggiator. And then there's a 64-step sequencer. Holding shift and setting will let you set some of the sequencer settings. So this goes up to 64 steps. Let's settle for 8. And there are a few playback modes. We'll get back to this in a bit. Let's create a sequence. You can either step sequence or record live. When you hit record, it kind of hits at both of the options: start, stop for live recording and edit for step sequencing. Let's hit edit, then play our sequence. So we've got that. Let's maybe turn down the tempo a bit. And the sequencer is polyphonic. So let's maybe initialize it, hit record, step sequence. You can hit multiple notes. It takes velocity into consideration as you play as well. And I see we're back to a 16-step sequence. It's easy to change that. Let's go back to 8. Anyway, that's our pattern. I could have also tied notes or added rests if I wanted while I was step sequencing, and you can also sequence live. There's a metronome, and you can add notes on top of a pattern. And since that wasn't too great, there's also an undo here, which you get to by hitting edit and rec. I won't go through all the hidden shortcuts here because there are quite a few in the sequencer. Let's check our undo. Yep. What else? You can also edit the individual steps in a sequence. And if we go ahead to the next column, there's probability options here and also substeps or ratchet options. And like I mentioned, there are also 4 automation lanes. These 2 you can either step sequence or just automate. Let's go into step sequencing, hit edit again, and you can see the 4 parameters per step. So I could choose to, say, close the filter up here and maybe open it up in this step a bit. So that is step sequenced. That's kind of abrupt. There's also a sequencer setting that will smoothen automation. Slightly smoother. Anyway, that's the step sequencing of automation, and I can add up to 4 parameters per step. And if I add too many, then it'll shift the other ones back up, which I didn't want. And now I've messed everything up. I can always clear just the automation if I want. And the second option for automation is just to record it live into the pattern. One thing you need to be really careful of is if you exit the sequencer and you think you're editing steps, but you're really swapping presets, then everything you did in here will be gone. There's no undo for that. Hopefully they can add it or add a warning in a future firmware update. There's also an interesting random sequence generator. So hit Shift and random, then choose a key, a scale, and a few other options. Hit Generate. And it'll do something. Randomize again. Let's make it a bit more busy. So perhaps a nice way to get going in an interesting direction. While the sequence is going, you can choose to either play on top of it, or if you want, go into settings and transpose it with the keyboard. There are a few other funky performance functions here. For example, if you hit Edit and Tie, then you can choose start and stop points using the motional pad. Kind of like a temporary loop point for as long as you're holding these buttons. So those are pretty much the highlights for the sequencer. And there's also a chord mode. You program in chords by holding the chord button and adding notes to the chord. Then while we're here, the mod wheel is set to vibrato at the LFO rate, but by using the handy dandy menu and controller shortcut, you can change that to a number of different things. Say, for example, filter cutoff. And a cool function of the pitch bend wheel, so you can use it as pitch bend, which will transpose all the notes in a chord. But if we go into the settings, maybe choose a slightly more aggressive pitch bend range. So that's easy. Anyway, a cool bend mode is C+L, which basically only bends the last note you play. Based on the bend range, which is something pretty cool I've not seen anywhere else. Okay, moving on, let's talk a bit about the models. It comes bundled with the SH101 model, with quite a few SH101 patches. These aren't ACB based, so unlike the boutiques, they're based on Zencore. And like I mentioned earlier, you can add these three models. I'm particularly fond of the JX8P. These are available to buy or to rent, I think, if you get the WC1 adapter, that wireless dongle stuck in the back here. Aside from coming with their own dedicated presets, you'll notice a few things change in the controls. If I hit the menu here, you'll see things look very different based on the model you load up. So this, for example, has only 2 oscillators, and then the knobs and faders do different things, and you can see which knobs and faders are active if you go into this view mode. So this map shows you, for example, that these top knobs just aren't active in this model, just the bottom ones. You can see what each does will be different based on the model. So let's say I go back into the SH101 model, then it has a different map with only 1 oscillator, and it has different active knobs. So here you determine the sub-oscillator level, pulse width level. So the not great thing about these models is that often the knobs don't do what their label says they do, and many of the controls aren't active. So for example, here you can see that these faders don't do anything except this one, which does something totally different. So I think the main reason to get these is just for the presets they come with, though some of the models have additional features that the Gaia synth doesn't. So for example, here, I think, yes, we've got a few vintage models, the sequential Moog and Roland models. Some of these models, by the way, support aftertouch. I tried the JX8P and it supports polyphonic aftertouch, which is pretty cool, but you need to use an external keyboard for that. The built-in keyboard doesn't have aftertouch. Speaking of the WC1 and Roland Cloud, you can also import and export presets, as well as install Roland Cloud presets on the device. I'm making this video before the official launch, so no Gaia 2 presets were available as of the making of this video, but presets for the various models were. So if you've got a cloud subscription, or if you bought these preset packs, transferring them wirelessly using the Roland app is really easy. And it's pretty cool that you can try them out before deciding whether you want to save them on the device or not. Once you've saved these patches to your presets, then you can flick through them and the regular ones, just as if they were one of the regular presets. A few other miscellaneous items. There's portamento, as you'd expect. And there's a Unison mode. So you've got Unison detune and Unison spread controls. Pretty cool. And then I won't go through all the settings in here, but you can set this to transmit MIDI. And once you do, I think aside from the synth inside here, this is actually a pretty nice controller for software synths. So each of the faders and most of the knobs all send out MIDI CCs. And if there's a software synth you use a lot, if you've got the patience to map these controls manually to your plugin controls, this can be a pretty comprehensive controller for your software synths. And don't forget to also map the XY pad, not just because you can use it as a control, but also because you can record motions and then these will play back as CCs into your synth. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons for Gaia 2 in light of the competition. The fact that this is a wavetable/wave shaping synth sets it apart from many of the synths in this price range, but unlike some of the synths in this price range, it's not analog, so if that's important to you, this isn't. If we clear those two out, synths that come to mind in this price range are Roland's own SH4D, Modwave, Argon 8, Hydrasynth, Blofeld, and even the cheaper MicroFreak and Fireball. Let me know in the comments if I missed one. Obviously, there are more expensive wavetable synths like Iridium, Peak, Nina, and Third Wave, but price-wise, they're not in the same ballpark. The biggest pro for Gaia 2 relative to its peers, I think, is the extreme hands-on nature of its design. Each module gets plenty of dedicated controls, so there's much less mucking about pressing buttons to choose which oscillator do you want to control, which LFO you want to control, or envelope you're editing. And then the faders or controls being in the wrong place if you swap to a different LFO or envelope. The interface also, I think, is very well designed. So when you get a few basic things like holding the menu button and turning a knob to edit that module's parameters, I think it's very easy to understand what's going on, and it will probably take you less time just to poke around and figure things out on your own than opening up the manual. I mentioned this earlier, just hold menu and touch the pitch bend wheel and you can edit its parameters. Compare that to how long it takes you to find this parameter in your synths menus. Another major pro for Gaia 2 is its timbral range and effects. It can do anything from soft pads to hard digital wavetable style sounds. The chorus is excellent, I think, as are the delay, reverb, and all the other effects. Not to mention effects you won't find, I think, on any other synth in this price range, like the pitch shifter, scatter, or loop effects. And the fact that you can often modulate the effect parameters is also an excellent plus. And then the final pro, I think, is the motional pad. I don't think it's a gimmick. I think it's fast and easy to use it as both a control surface and a mod source. And using it with the phase and shaper mod lets you interact with the synth's wavetable sounds in a meaningful way. But that said, it's not all pros. On the cons side, Gaia 2 isn't multi-timbral, so you can't create splits or layers or use an external sequencer to sequence one sound while you're playing another. It does have 3 oscillators, and you can sort of get around this limitation somewhat by modulating oscillator levels in the mixer to create complex evolving sounds, but that's not true multi-timbrality. Also, you've got only one wavetable oscillator. Some of its peers have more. Then in terms of modulation, there's no mod matrix. Now, simplicity is always a good thing, and while the motional pad and sequencer are interesting mod sources and the LFOs have 4 destinations and fancy step options, you can't point the envelopes to anything but the filter and the amp they're designed for, and the oscillator envelope has only one available destination, and that is to only just a handful of oscillator parameters. There are a few built-in destinations for velocity and for the mod wheel, but for better or worse, if you're looking for a massive mod matrix in here, you won't find it. Another important thing you need to be aware of is that unlike some, but not all of its competitors, you can't load up user wavetables into the wavetable oscillator or user samples into the noise generator. And even though the models here are based on Zencore, this isn't a Zencore synth, meaning it doesn't support any of the sample-based tones or many of the other features in Roland's Zencore engine. This, say, unlike the Jupiter XM, Juno X, MC101 or MC707, which have the full Zencore engine built in with all its samples and thousands of presets. Finally, on the hardware side, while the keybed does feel very nice, it's just velocity sensitive and doesn't have aftertouch. Beside that, there are things on my wish list that I hope are on the firmware side. Roland, please give us a filter that doesn't lose so much bass when you crank up the resonance. I also noticed that even if an oscillator's level is set to 0, changing its waveform will re-trigger the envelope for some reason. Hopefully they can disable that. There are a couple other bugs I found in here, but nothing major that I encountered. And finally, it would be nice if we had a per voice panning mode similar to the one we get in the Unison feature. So that's it for Gaia 2. Stick around for quite a few preset examples, and if you'd like plenty of ideas for where to point LFOs, motional paths, or anything else synthesis related, check out my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.